We all know what it feels like to build walls around our hearts, thinking they protect us from pain. But what happens when someone comes along with the power to tear those walls down with nothing more than their voice? Alpha King Kaelen ruled his kingdom with strength and stone-cold calculation. For 15 years, he crushed enemies and turned alliances into victories. Mating was just another contract to him. No voice had ever moved him. No song had ever stirred his soul. Then Elira stepped into his court, a mysterious Omega bard with a warm cloak and an impossible challenge. She offered him a wager that would change everything. If her voice could move his unmovable heart, she would claim not just his favor, but his love itself. The court fell silent as her untrained but pure melody began cutting through his carefully built defenses. What secret was hidden in her song that left the most powerful alpha utterly speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The throne of Starfall Steel had witnessed 3 centuries of rule, its dark surface forged from metal that fell from the heavens themselves. Today, as golden afternoon light filtered through the towering stained glass windows of the Great Hall, it seemed to absorb the very essence of power that surrounded it. Alpha King Kaelen Draconis sat upon that ancient seat, his broad shoulders filling the ornate frame as he presided over the daily court proceedings with the same methodical precision that had won him a dozen wars. At 34, Kaelen possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. His dark hair, touched with early silver at the temples, was pulled back in the practical style of a warrior king. Scars traced subtle lines across his hands and forearms, testament to battles fought personally rather than from the safety of command tents. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as different from the pampered nobility around him. They were the color of winter storms, gray and unforgiving, and they missed nothing. The kingdom of Valdris stretched from the Ironspine Mountains in the north to the golden seaports in the south, a realm built on strength, hierarchy, and the unshakable belief that alpha blood ran truer than any other. Here, birth determined destiny with mathematical certainty. Alphas ruled and conquered. Betas served and managed. Omegas, when they weren't hidden away in countryside estates, provided the next generation of carefully planned bloodlines. It was a system that had brought prosperity and stability for generations. And Kaelen had no intention of changing what worked. Chancellor Aldrich Reverencrest stood at the king's right hand, a man whose silver beard and sharp intellect had guided 3 monarchs through the labyrinthine politics of court life. His loyalty was absolute, his memory encyclopedic, and his understanding of bloodline politics unmatched in the realm. At 62, he had weathered enough political storms to recognize when new ones were brewing on the horizon. "Your Majesty," Aldrich murmured, leaning close enough that his words wouldn't carry beyond the throne. "Lady Seraphina requests a private audience regarding the Northland's trade agreements." Kaelen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lady Seraphina Goldman was everything a queen should be according to traditional standards. An alpha born of the highest bloodline, educated in statecraft, beautiful in the classical sense, and utterly without the weakness of sentiment. She was also relentless in her pursuit of the crown, approaching their potential union with the same strategic thinking she applied to her family's vast commercial enterprises. The match made perfect political sense, which was precisely why Kaelen found himself dreading the inevitable conversation. "Schedule it for tomorrow," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had never been questioned. After the morning weapons training, the great doors of the hall stood open, allowing petitioners and courtiers to flow in and out like a carefully choreographed dance. Merchants seeking trade agreements, nobles presenting disputes for royal judgment, ambassadors bringing news from neighboring kingdoms, all of them approached the throne with the deference due to a king who had expanded, Valders's borders and doubled its wealth during his reign. Captain Marcus Thorne, the king's closest friend and commander of the royal guard, moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had fought beside his sovereign in more battles than either cared to count. His auburn hair and ready smile made him popular among the court ladies, but his sword arm and tactical mind made him invaluable to the crown. He caught Kaelen's eye and nodded toward the main entrance, a signal they had developed over years of shared campaigns. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when she appeared. At first glance, Elira seemed unremarkable against the backdrop of elaborately dressed courtiers and nobles. Her traveling cloak was well made, but clearly worn from long roads, her boots practical rather than fashionable. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than inherited privilege. But there was something about the way she moved through the crowd unhurried, despite the obvious wealth and power surrounding her, observant without appearing to stare, that caught the attention of those with eyes to see. Her hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, the color of autumn leaves touched by firelight. Her features were pleasant rather than striking, the kind of face that might be easily overlooked in a crowd, but became more beautiful the longer one looked. But it was her eyes that would linger in memory, warm brown with flecks of gold, eyes that had seen both sorrow and wonder and had not been hardened by either. The silver pendant at her throat caught the light as she walked, its simple design marking her as a traveling bard. Such performers were common enough at court, though most came by invitation or recommendation. This woman had simply appeared, as if the road itself had carried her to the throne room doors. Chancellor Aldrich frowned as he noticed her approach. Protocol demanded that entertainers be properly announced and scheduled. The presence of an uninvited performer suggested either a breakdown in palace security or remarkable audacity on the woman's part. Given the calm confidence in her stride, he suspected the latter. "Your Majesty," Aldrich began, but Kaelen raised a hand to silence him. The king had noticed her too, though he couldn't say precisely what had drawn his attention. Perhaps it was the way she moved, without the calculated grace of court ladies or the nervous deference of common petitioners. She approached the throne as if she belonged there, not through arrogance, but through some quiet certainty that her presence was exactly where fate intended it to be. The conversations around the throne room gradually quieted as nobles and courtiers became aware of the unusual situation unfolding. An unknown Omega approaching the throne without permission was unprecedented. Some watched with amusement, expecting to witness an entertaining rejection. Others felt a stirring of unease, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Lady Sarafina, who had been engaged in quiet conversation with several powerful alpha families, turned her attention to the approaching figure with sharp interest. Her political instincts were finely honed, and she recognized the potential disruption when she saw one. The woman's Omega scent was subtle but unmistakable, carrying notes of wildflowers and distant rain, nothing that should pose a threat to established order. Yet something about the situation felt dangerous. Elira stopped at the traditional distance from the throne, neither too close to suggest presumption, nor too far to indicate fear. She inclined her head in a respectful bow that acknowledged Kaelen's position without the excessive deference that most subjects displayed. When she raised her eyes to meet his, there was no challenge in her gaze, but no submission either. Simply recognition, one person of worth acknowledging another. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall. It was warm and melodious, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard, but not to demanding attention. "I am Elira of the Singing Winds, and I come with a proposition that may interest a king known for his appreciation of worthy challenges." A murmur ran through the assembled court. Propositions from unknown Omegas to Alpha Kings were simply not part of the established order. Yet no one moved to intervene. perhaps sensing that Kaelen himself was curious about what would come next. The king studied her for a long moment, taking in details that his warrior's training had taught him to notice. The way she stood balanced and alert, suggesting physical conditioning beyond what most court dwellers possessed. The calluses on her fingertips, visible now that she had lowered her hands from her bow marks of a musician who practiced her craft seriously. The small scar along her left temple, faded but still visible, hinting at a life that had included more than comfortable performance venues. "Speak," Kaelen commanded, his voice carrying both authority and genuine interest. Elira smiled then, an expression that transformed her pleasant features into something genuinely beautiful. It was the smile of someone who had just heard exactly the response she had hoped for, as if this moment had been precisely what she had traveled so far to find. "I have heard tales of your strength, your majesty, of victories won through strategy, and courage, of a ruler who values merit above empty flattery. Such stories travel far beyond your borders, carried by merchants and wanderers who've witnessed the prosperity your leadership has brought to Valdres." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the silent hall before continuing. "But I have also heard that you are a man who understands the value of rare things, weapons forged by master smiths, horses bred for both beauty and endurance, alliances built on mutual respect rather than mere convenience. Today, I offer you something rarer still, a challenge that cannot be won through sword or strategy, but only through the willingness to let yourself be moved by something beyond the reach of power." The golden coin appeared in her palm as if by magic, catching the late afternoon light and casting dancing reflections on the stone floor. It bore no royal seal, no mark of any kingdom, but its surface gleamed with the purity that only true gold possessed. When she spoke again, her voice carried the formal cadence of an ancient ritual being invoked. "I propose a wager, your majesty. If my song can touch your heart, if my voice can reach past the armor of crown and duty to the man beneath, then I claim the right to remain at your court not as a subject, but as an equal. And if it cannot..." She let the words hang in the air, her smile becoming mysterious rather than confident. "Then I will leave your kingdom as quietly as I entered it, and trouble your reign no more." The silence that followed Elira's challenge stretched like a taut bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Every person in the throne room seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the king's response to what could only be described as the most audacious proposition ever presented to the crown of Valdres. Even the servants had stopped their quiet movements, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be recounted for years to come. Kaelen's storm-gray eyes never left Elira's face as he considered her words. In 15 years of rule, he had faced down rebellious nobles, cunning ambassadors, and desperate enemy commanders, but none had approached him with quite this combination of respect and boldness. The challenge itself was unlike anything in his experience, not a test of strength or strategy, but something far more dangerous. She was asking him to lower his guard, to allow himself to be vulnerable in front of his entire court. Chancellor Aldrich shifted uncomfortably beside the throne, his political instincts screaming warnings about the precedent such a spectacle might set. And Omega, challenging the emotional fortress of an alpha king, flew in the face of every social convention that maintained order in their world. Yet he could see that Kaelen was genuinely intrigued, and long experience had taught him to trust his sovereign's judgment, even when it ventured into uncharted territory. "An interesting proposition," Kaelen said finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "But I find myself curious about the stakes involved. You speak of remaining at court as an equal, but what does that mean to a traveling bard? With no title, no lands, and no political alliances." Elira's fingers closed around the gold coin, and when she opened her hand again, it had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The simple magic was smoothly done, speaking of years of practice, but it was the confidence in her smile that truly captured attention. "Perhaps, Your Majesty, that is precisely what makes the wager interesting. I come with nothing to lose except the freedom of the road, and everything to gain if my voice proves worthy of your attention. As for what equality might mean," she tilted her head slightly, studying his face with open curiosity. "I suspect that is a question better answered by action than by words." From somewhere within her worn cloak, she drew forth a small silver pendant that gleamed with its own inner light. The moment it appeared, a subtle change rippled through the atmosphere of the throne room. The pendant was carved in the shape of a songbird in flight, its wings spread wide, and though it seemed simple enough, there was something about it that made the eye linger and the mind wonder. Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her silk gown rustling against the stone floor. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style that emphasized her classical alpha beauty, and her blue eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her family's commercial empire the envy of neighboring kingdoms. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Your Majesty, surely the business of the crown is too important to be interrupted by the whims of an unknown performer. The Northland's trade agreements require immediate attention, and Ambassador Thorn is waiting to discuss the border situation with Asteria." The political reminder was smoothly delivered, but Kaelen could hear the underlying tension in Seraphine's words. She had spent months carefully positioning herself as the logical choice for Queen, building alliances and demonstrating her suitability for the role. The sudden appearance of this mysterious Omega represented an unwelcome variable in her carefully calculated plans. Captain Thorn moved closer to the throne, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, not in threat, but in the automatic readiness of a warrior who had learned to expect the unexpected. His green eyes studied Elira with professional assessment, noting details that others might miss. The way she held herself suggested training in movement and balance. Her awareness of the room's layout and exit spoke of someone who had learned to read dangerous situations quickly. Most intriguingly, she showed no sign of the nervousness that should have affected anyone making such a bold challenge to royal authority. "I am prepared to witness this wager," Thorn announced, his clear voice cutting through the murmured conversations that had begun among the courtiers. "If His Majesty finds the challenge worthy of consideration." The formal support from the kingdom's most trusted military leader shifted the balance of the moment. If Captain Thorn saw merit in allowing the challenge to proceed, then the situation moved beyond mere court entertainment into something that required serious attention. Kaelen rose from the throne of starfall steel with fluid grace, his height and presence immediately commanding the full attention of everyone present. At 6 feet and 4 inches, he possessed the kind of physical authority that came from years of personal combat rather than ceremonial display. The crown he wore was simple compared to those favored by other monarchs, a circlet of white gold that emphasized function over ostentation, much like the man who wore it. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying the finality of royal decree. "I accept your wager, Elira of the Singing Winds. But understand this, I am not a man easily moved by sentiment or performance. If you truly believe your voice can reach past defenses that have protected this crown for 15 years, then let us see what power you claim to possess." The king descended the steps of the throne platform, each movement deliberate and controlled. As he reached the main floor of the hall, servants quickly arranged a chair that would allow him to sit while still maintaining a position of authority. The gesture was significant. By leaving the throne, Kaelen was acknowledging that this moment required his personal attention rather than the distant authority of kingship. Elira watched his approach with calm attention, neither retreating nor advancing as he drew near. When he was seated, she moved to a position that would allow her voice to carry clearly throughout the hall while maintaining the respectful distance. appropriate to their respective stations. The pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with gentle light, though whether from the late afternoon sun or some inner source was impossible to determine. "Before I begin," she said, her warm voice now addressing not just the king but the entire assembled court, "I want you to know that this song comes from a place deeper than mere performance. It carries the weight of stories I have gathered in. My travels tales of love found and lost, of courage discovered in unexpected moments, of the quiet heroism that ordinary people display when faced with extraordinary circumstances." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, something fundamental had changed in her expression. The pleasant mask of courtly politeness had fallen away, revealing depths of emotion and experience that transformed her from a mere entertainer into something far more powerful. When she began to sing, her voice rose clear and true, filling the stone hall with a melody that seemed to come from the very heart of human longing. The song told no specific story, used no words that the court scholars could later transcribe and analyze. Instead, it wove together pure emotion in musical form: the ache of separation, the joy of reunion, the bittersweet recognition that all beautiful things must eventually pass away. It spoke of winter nights when the only warmth came from memories of summer, of dawn breaking over battlefields where victory came at too high a price, of the moment when a parent looks upon their child and sees both infinite possibility and heartbreaking fragility. As the melody rose and fell, carried by a voice that had clearly been shaped by years of practice but never formally trained, something unprecedented began to happen in the throne room of Valdres. The assembled courtiers, trained from birth to maintain proper composure regardless of circumstances, found themselves struggling with emotions they had not felt so keenly in years. Even the servants paused in their duties, drawn by a music that seemed to speak directly to parts of themselves they had almost forgotten existed. But it was the effect on King Kaelen that would be remembered long after the last notes faded into silence. The man who had faced down armies without flinching, who had negotiated treaties with the cold precision of a master strategist, who had worn the crown for 15 years without ever showing weakness or uncertainty, sat transfixed as Elira's voice reached past every defense he had ever built. For in that haunting melody, he heard the echo of another voice, one that had been silenced 8 years ago on a battlefield far from home. The last note of Elira's song hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and ephemeral, before fading into a silence so complete that even the distant sounds of the castle seemed to have stopped in reverence. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the throne room of Valdres held its breath, waiting for the king's response to a challenge that had just shifted the very foundations of their ordered world. Kaelen sat motionless in his chair, his storm-gray eyes fixed on Elira's face, but seeing something far beyond the present moment. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, built stone by stone through years of lost duty and the loneliness that came with absolute power, had been shaken by her voice in ways he had not thought possible. The memory that her song had awakened was one he had buried so deeply that he had convinced himself it no longer held power over him. Liana, sweet, brave Liana, with her warrior spirit and her laugh that could light up the darkest winter evening. She had died in his arms on the bloody fields of Ravenshollow, her life bleeding away through wounds meant for him, her final words a whispered promise that love would find him again if he had the courage to recognize it when it came. The profound silence stretched until Chancellor Aldrich cleared his throat, the small sound somehow thunderous in the hushed hall. Political instincts honed by decades of court life told him that this moment required careful management. The king's obvious reaction to the Omega song had implications that rippled far beyond a simple wager between strangers. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said carefully, "shall I summon the court scribe to record the terms of the agreement?" The formal question broke Kaelen's reverie, pulling him back to the present with the jarring efficiency of cold water. He blinked once, his expression smoothing into the controlled mask that had become second nature during his years of rule. But those who knew him well, Captain Thorne, Chancellor Aldrich, even Lady Seraphina, could see that something fundamental had shifted in their king's demeanor. "The wager stands," Kaelen said, his voice steady but carrying undertones that had not been there before. He rose from his chair with careful deliberation, every movement watched by the assembled court. "Elira of the Singing Winds has indeed moved this king with her voice. Therefore, she has earned the right to remain at court as agreed." A murmur ran through the throne room like wind through wheat, nobles and courtiers exchanging glances that spoke volumes about the unprecedented nature of what they had just witnessed. An unknown Omega had challenged the emotional defenses of their Alpha King and emerged victorious. The implications for court hierarchy, political alliances, and future succession were staggering. Lady Seraphine's perfectly composed features betrayed only the slightest tightening around her blue eyes, but those who understood court politics recognized the expression. She had just watched her carefully laid plans encounter an obstacle she had never anticipated. With the practiced grace of a woman raised in political circles, she stepped forward and offered Elira a smile that managed to be both welcoming and calculating. "How delightful," Seraphina said, her melodious voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "It has been far too long since court has been graced by genuine musical talent. I do hope you will honor us with more performances during your stay." The words were perfectly chosen, acknowledging Elira's victory while subtly emphasizing her role as entertainer rather than equal. It was a masterful demonstration of political maneuvering that established boundaries while appearing gracious, and several of the assembled nobles nodded approvingly at Seraphine's smooth handling of a potentially awkward situation. Elira inclined her head respectfully toward the lady, her warm brown eyes showing no offense at the implied classification. "You are very kind, Lady Seraphina. I look forward to learning from the customs and traditions of Valdris during my time here." The response was diplomatically perfect, neither accepting the implied subordination nor challenging it directly. Captain Thorne watched the exchange with growing interest, recognizing in Elira's words the kind of careful phrasing that suggested experience with delicate political situations. This was no simple traveling performer, overcome by the grandeur of royal court. This was someone who understood the games being played around her. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows that painted the throne room in hues of gold and crimson. The daily court session was drawing to its natural close, but the energy in the hall suggested that the real conversations were only beginning. As courtiers and nobles began their careful dispersal, small groups formed with the organic efficiency of people who understood that information was the most valuable currency in any kingdom. In the deep archives beneath the castle, where dust motes danced in shafts of light from high windows, lay a leather-bound volume that had not been disturbed for nearly a century. The Chronicle of Forgotten Queens contained records that most of the current nobility had never seen, histories that had been deliberately allowed to fade from common knowledge as the rigid caste system of modern Valdris had solidified into immutable law. The book told stories of Omega queens who had ruled with wisdom and strength, of Alpha-Omega partnerships that had brought prosperity and peace to the kingdom, of a time when compatibility of spirit had mattered more than the arbitrary classifications of blood. It recorded the reign of Queen Lirelei the Wise, whose song magic had once protected the realm from invasion, and whose bloodline had supposedly died out 3 centuries ago, when the old ways gave way to new traditions. But perhaps most importantly, it contained genealogical records that traced the complex web of royal bloodlines back to their sources, documenting connections that modern court scholars had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. These pages held secrets that could reshape the political landscape of Valdres. If anyone thought to look for them, as evening approached and the throne room emptied of all but the most essential personnel, Kaelen found himself standing alone before the great windows that looked out over his kingdom. The familiar weight of the crown seemed heavier than usual, pressing down upon him with questions he had not asked himself in years. What did it mean to rule with both strength and compassion? Could duty and desire ever truly be reconciled? And, most dangerously of all, what happened when a heart that had been frozen by necessity began to thaw? The sound of soft footsteps on stone made him turn, expecting to see Chancellor Aldrich with the evening's reports or Captain Thorm with security briefings. Instead, he found Elira approaching with her characteristic unhurried grace, her worn, traveling cloak replaced by a simple but well-fitted dress in deep blue that brought out the golden flecks in her brown eyes. "Your Majesty," she said, offering the same respectful bow she had given earlier, "I wanted to thank you for allowing me to fulfill my wager. It took considerable courage to accept a challenge that could have had no benefit for you, regardless of the outcome." Kaelen studied her face, searching for signs of calculation or hidden agenda, but finding only genuine gratitude and something else, a recognition, perhaps, of what that moment of vulnerability had cost him in front of his court. 3 days had passed since Elira's song had echoed through the throne room, and the ripples of that moment continued to spread through the castle like stones cast into still water. The servants whispered about it as they went about their duties. The nobles discussed it in their private chambers, and the merchants in the lower city had already begun spinning tales that would carry the story far beyond the borders of Valdiar in. The depths of the castle's ancient library, Elira moved quietly between towering shelves that had been collecting knowledge for longer than the current kingdom had existed. The head librarian, a scholarly beta named Master Alduin, had granted her access with surprising enthusiasm once he learned of her interest in the musical traditions of the realm. What he didn't know was that she sought knowledge far more specific than general cultural education. The Chronicle of Forgotten Queens lay hidden behind more recent volumes, its leather binding worn smooth by centuries, but its pages still crisp and readable. As Elira carefully turned through the ancient text, her breath caught at the illuminated genealogical charts that mapped bloodlines back through the mists of time. There, traced in fading ink and confirmed by multiple sources, was the lineage she had hoped and feared to find. Queen Lirelei the Wise had indeed ruled Valdres 300 years ago, her reign marked by prosperity, peace, and the protection of powerful song magic that had turned aside 3 separate invasions without the need for bloodshed. According to the Chronicle, her bloodline had supposedly ended with the death of her only daughter in a plague that swept through the kingdom in the following generation. But the careful notations in the margins, written in a different hand, told a different story. The daughter had survived, hidden away by loyal servants, who feared the political upheaval that might come if enemies of the old ways discovered that Lirelei's magical heritage lived on. She had been raised in obscurity, far from court, her abilities suppressed and her true identity buried beneath carefully constructed lies. The bloodline had continued, passed down through generations of women who were taught to hide their gifts and live as common folk rather than claim their rightful place in history. Elira's fingers traced the delicate script that recorded names and dates stretching down through the centuries, a hidden history of her own family that she had only begun to understand when her grandmother lay dying 3 winters ago. The old woman's final words had been a whispered command to seek the truth of their heritage, to find the song magic that ran in their blood, and to restore the balance that had been lost when fear triumphed over wisdom. Interesting reading? The voice came from directly behind her, cultured and pleasant, but carrying undertones that made Elira's blood run cold. She turned slowly to find Lady Seraphina standing in the narrow aisle between the shelves, her elegant gown somehow pristine, despite the dust that coated everything else in this forgotten corner of the library. Her blue eyes glittered with intelligence and something far more dangerous, the look of a predator who had just discovered exactly what her prey had been hiding. "Lady Seraphina," Elira said carefully, closing the chronicle with deliberate calm, "I didn't hear you approach. I was simply researching the musical traditions of Valdris to better understand the cultural context of court life." Seraphina stepped closer, her movements graceful and controlled, but Elira could sense the coiled tension beneath the polished exterior. "How fascinating. And what have you learned about our musical traditions? Anything particularly illuminating? About bloodlines and forgotten queens?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade poised to strike. Elira realized that her presence in the castle had not gone unnoticed, that someone with Lady Seraphine's resources and political acumen would naturally investigate any potential threat to her carefully laid plans. The only question now was how much Seraphina actually knew versus how much she merely suspected. "I've learned that Valdris has a rich heritage of song and story," Elira replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Music has always played an important role in the cultural life of the kingdom, though perhaps not always in the same ways." "Indeed." Seraphine's smile was sharp as winter frost. "Some might say that's certain. Traditions have been allowed to fade for very good reasons. The old ways brought chaos and uncertainty. The current system has given us 3 centuries of stability and prosperity. It would be unfortunate if anyone sought to disrupt that balance based on romantic notions about the past." The threat was elegantly delivered but unmistakable. Seraphina was making it clear that she understood exactly what Elira represented and that she had no intention of allowing an Omega with questionable bloodlines to interfere with the natural order of succession. The conversation had the feel of a chess match where both players were still learning the positions of the pieces while planning their strategies several moves ahead. "Stability is indeed valuable," Elira agreed, matching Seraphine's pleasant tone while carefully replacing the chronicle on its shelf. "Though I imagine that true strength comes from adapting to changing circumstances rather than simply maintaining old patterns. Change for the sake of change is the luxury of those who have never held real responsibility," Seraphina countered. "Those of us who understand the weight of leadership know that some traditions exist because they work, not because they are merely convenient." The exchange was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy boots on stone, that announced the arrival of someone with military bearing. Captain Thorne appeared around the corner of the shelving unit, his green eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a professional soldier. His presence seemed to ease some of the tension in the narrow space, though whether by accident or design was impossible to determine. "Lady Seraphina, Miss Elira," he said with a respectful nod to each woman. "His Majesty has requested that you both join him in the Blue Salon for evening refreshments. Chancellor Aldrich will be presenting the weekly reports, and the king thought you might find the proceedings educational." The invitation was clearly a royal command despite its polite phrasing, and both women understood that declining was not an option. Seraphine's smile became genuinely warm as she turned her attention to the captain, her entire demeanor shifting as smoothly as if someone had changed masks. "How thoughtful of His Majesty," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of pleased surprise. "I would be delighted to attend. The kingdom's business is always fascinating. I'm sure Miss Elira will find it illuminating to observe how royal decisions are made." Elira inclined her head gracefully, recognizing the subtle emphasis on her status as observer rather than participant. "I am honored by the king's consideration. Thank you, Captain Thorne, for delivering the invitation personally." As they made their way through the castle corridors toward the Blue Salon, Elira found herself walking slightly behind the other two, listening to their easy conversation about court matters and mutual acquaintances. The interaction revealed the depth of Seraphine's integration into the power structures of Valdris. She knew the names, understood the relationships, and could discuss policy implications with the fluency of someone who had been preparing for royal responsibility her entire life. The blue salon was elegantly appointed but comfortable, designed for informal gatherings rather than state functions. Evening light filtered through tall windows, casting warm shadows across richly upholstered chairs and polished wooden tables. King Kaelen stood near the fireplace, still wearing the formal attire of his daily court sessions, but with a relaxed bearing that suggested the end of official business. When the three entered, his eyes found Elira's immediately, and she felt that same jolt of connection that had passed between them during her song 3 days ago. But now there was something else in his gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of questions that he had not yet learned how to ask. The blue salon filled with the warm amber light of evening as Chancellor Aldrich spread his reports across the mahogany table with the methodical precision of a man who had performed this ritual countless times. The weekly briefings were a cornerstone of Kaelen's rule, a careful review of kingdom affairs that ensured no detail escaped royal attention. Tonight, however, the familiar routine felt charged with new significance as 3 very different women took their seats around the polished surface. Lady Seraphina settled into the chair to Kaelen's right with practiced grace, her posture perfect, and her attention focused entirely on the documents before them. She had attended these sessions before, part of her careful preparation for the role she intended to fill as queen. Her contributions were always insightful, her questions revealing a mind trained in statecraft and commerce. She belonged here in every way that centuries of tradition could define. Elira took the chair that Captain Thorn indicated, several seats down from the king, but positioned where she could observe the proceedings clearly. Her presence represented something unprecedented in Omega at a royal planning session, admitted not through bloodline or political alliance, but through the strange victory of a musical wager. She sat quietly, her warm brown eyes taking in every detail, while her expression remained respectfully neutral. "The first matter concerns the northern border situation," Aldrich began, his cultured voice carrying the weight of years spent managing royal business. "Our scouts report increased activity from the Shadowlands. Nothing overtly hostile yet, but their patrols have been testing our response times along the mountain passes." Kaelen leaned forward slightly, his warrior's instincts immediately engaged. "Numbers and positioning?" "Approximately 200 mounted soldiers, rotating in groups of 50. They appear to be mapping our defensive installations rather than planning immediate assault." Aldrich consulted his notes with practiced efficiency. "Captain Thorn believes they're gathering intelligence for future use rather than preparing current action." "Agreed," Thorn confirmed, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had fought more border skirmishes than anyone cared to count. "Their movements follow classic reconnaissance patterns. They're learning our capabilities and response protocols, likely preparing detailed reports for their war council." Lady Seraphina interjected smoothly, her political mind immediately grasping the broader implications. This could be connected to the succession dispute in their capital. Prince Mordain has been gathering support for his claim to the Shadowland throne, and a successful military campaign against Valdris would certainly strengthen his position with their warrior nobility. The observation was astute, demonstrating her understanding of the complex political relationships that governed interactions between kingdoms. Kaelen nodded approvingly, recognizing the value of her analysis. This was exactly the kind of insight that made their potential political union so attractive from a strategic standpoint. "What are our current defensive capabilities along that border?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from memory. 3 fully staffed fortresses with overlapping fields of coverage, Thorn replied. "Each can hold independently for at least 2 weeks under siege conditions. And our rapid response cavalry can reach any point along the border within 6 hours of receiving signals. Excellent. Continue monitoring, but don't escalate unless they cross into our territory. Kaelen's decision was firm and immediate, the product of years spent balancing aggression with prudence. Next, Aldrich turned to another section of his reports, and as he did so, something unexpected happened. Elira spoke for the first time since taking her seat, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the room. Your Majesty, may I ask about the civilian populations in the border villages? Are they aware of the increased military activity? The question caught everyone by surprise. It was perceptive, focusing on an aspect of the situation that the military and political discussions had not addressed, but it also represented a breach of protocol. Invited observers were expected to listen and learn, not participate in strategic planning sessions. Seraphine's blue eyes flashed with barely concealed irritation at the interruption, while Aldrich looked uncertain about how to respond to input from someone with no official standing. Captain Thorne, however, appeared thoughtful, as if the question had highlighted something he had been considering himself. Kaelen studied Elira's face for a moment before responding. An interesting concern. Chancellor, what is our current communication with the border settlements? Standard protocols are in place, Aldrich replied carefully. Local magistrates receive weekly reports and have instructions to evacuate if conditions warrant. However, the civilian populations have not been specifically informed about the increased surveillance. They should be, Elira said, then caught herself and added more formally, in my travels, I've observed that informed citizens make better decisions in dangerous situations than those left to wonder about unusual military movements. Fear of the unknown often causes more problems than knowledge of actual risks. The comment revealed experience that seemed inconsistent with her supposed background as a simple traveling performer. Lady Seraphine's expression sharpened as she filed away this additional piece of evidence that Elira was not what she appeared to be. An unconventional perspective, Seraphina said smoothly, though one might argue that detailed military information could create panic among populations untrained in strategic thinking. True, Elira acknowledged with perfect courtesy, but respectful honesty often builds stronger loyalty than protective deception, especially among people who have chosen to live in areas where danger is always a possibility. The philosophical difference underlying their exchange was subtle but significant. Seraphina advocated for the traditional approach of leadership that protected subjects by controlling information. Elira suggested a partnership model where citizens were trusted with truth and empowered to make informed choices. Kaelen found himself genuinely interested in both perspectives. His own inclination had always been toward transparency when possible, but political reality often demanded more careful management of information. The question of how much truth the people could handle and how much they deserved, regardless of their ability to handle it, was one that had occupied political philosophers for centuries. Captain Thorne, he said finally, prepare discretionary briefings for the border magistrates. Give them enough information to make intelligent decisions about their communities without revealing operational details that could compromise our defensive advantages. The solution was characteristically balanced, acknowledging both women's concerns while maintaining royal prerogative to determine the specifics of implementation. Thorne nodded approvingly. The compromise aligned with his own instincts about handling civilian populations in military situations. As the evening progressed through additional reports, trade negotiations with the southern ports, harvest projections for the coming season, infrastructure improvements in the capital Elira remained mostly silent. But Kaelen found himself increasingly aware of her presence, noting the subtle changes in her expression as different topics were discussed. She was clearly following every detail of the kingdom's business with an understanding that went far beyond casual interest. When, Aldrich finally closed his folders and announced the conclusion of the weekly briefing. The last rays of sunlight had faded from the windows, replaced by the warm glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the salon walls. The formal portion of the evening was complete, but no one seemed eager to leave the comfortable intimacy of the small gathering. Perhaps, Serafina suggested with a gracious smile, Miss Elira would honor us with another song? It seems appropriate to end such a productive discussion with music. The request was perfectly reasonable on its surface, but Elira sensed the calculation beneath it. Another performance would reinforce her role as entertainer rather than participant, subtly restoring the social hierarchy that her earlier comments had challenged. But it was King Kaelen's response that surprised everyone present. "Actually," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace, "I think I would prefer to hear more of Miss Elira's observations about kingdom management. Her perspective on civilian communication was quite insightful." The king's unexpected request hung in the air like a challenge, transforming what should have been a polite conclusion to the evening into something far more significant. Lady Seraphine's smile remained perfectly in place, but those who knew her well could detect the subtle tension that tightened the corners of her eyes. Chancellor Aldrich shifted his papers with unnecessary precision, his diplomatic instincts recognizing a moment that required careful navigation. Elira studied Kaelen's face, searching for some indication of his true intentions. The request could be genuine curiosity about her perspective, or it could be a test of some kind, an opportunity for her to reveal more about herself than she intended. Either way, declining would be impossible without giving offense to royal hospitality. "Your Majesty is very kind," she said carefully, "though I fear my observations are based more on personal experience than formal education in governance. I would not want to presume to offer advice where others with far greater expertise are available." The deflection was diplomatically perfect, acknowledging the honor while subtly indicating awareness of her position. But Kaelen was not to be deterred by courtly politeness. Personal experience often provides insights that formal education cannot, he replied, moving to stand near the fireplace where the dancing flames cast shifting shadows across his features. "In my years of rule, I've learned that truth comes from many sources, not all of them found in official reports or scholarly texts." Captain Thorne watched the exchange with growing interest, recognizing in his king's manner the same focused attention that had made him such an effective military strategist. When Kaelen pursued a line of inquiry with this kind of determination, it usually meant he had identified something significant that others had missed. "Very well," Elira said, accepting that retreat was no longer possible. "In my travels through the outer provinces, I've observed that the relationship between rulers and subjects often depends less on the wisdom of specific policies than on the trust that those policies will be explained honestly and implemented fairly." She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood that every phrase would be analyzed and remembered. People are willing to endure considerable hardship if they believe their sacrifices serve a purpose they understand and leaders they respect. But uncertainty breeds resentment faster than actual injustice, because imagination fills gaps in knowledge with fears that are often worse than reality. Lady Serafina leaned forward slightly, her political instincts recognizing both the insight and the implied criticism of traditional information control. An interesting theory, though one might argue that ordinary citizens lack the background necessary to fully understand the complexities involved in royal decision-making. Partial information could lead to misinterpretation and unrest. True, Elira acknowledged, but I've found that people are often more perceptive than their leaders assume. A farmer who can read weather patterns and soil conditions, plan crop rotations, and manage livestock through changing seasons possesses analytical skills that transfer to other areas. The knowledge base may be different, but the fundamental thinking processes are similar. Chancellor Aldrich found himself genuinely intrigued by the philosophical debate unfolding before him. As a man who had spent decades managing the flow of information through the kingdom's bureaucracy, he had wrestled with these questions countless times. The traditional approach emphasized stability and order, but he had occasionally wondered whether greater transparency might actually strengthen rather than weaken royal authority. What about situations where honest communication might compromise strategic advantages? He asked, his scholarly curiosity overcoming diplomatic caution. Surely there are circumstances where protective silence serves the greater good. Elira considered the question seriously before responding. Certainly there are military and diplomatic secrets that must be protected. But I think the key lies in distinguishing between information that genuinely requires secrecy and information that is withheld simply because it's easier than explaining complex situations to large numbers of people. She gestured toward the reports that still lay scattered across the table. Tonight's discussion of border security, for example. The specific details of fortress locations and troop movements obviously cannot be public knowledge, but the general fact that the kingdom is monitoring increased activity and has adequate defenses in place, that information actually strengthens rather than weakens security by reassuring citizens that their safety is being actively protected. King Kaelen found himself nodding approvingly at the analysis. It aligned with his own instinctive preference for straightforward communication, though political necessity had often forced him to adopt more circumspect approaches. The idea that transparency could be a tool of governance rather than a limitation on it was one that deserved serious consideration. You speak as if you have experience managing public communication during times of uncertainty, Serafina observed, her tone pleasant but carrying an undercurrent of sharp inquiry. Has your career as a traveling performer provided opportunities for such observations? The question was expertly crafted to expose potential inconsistencies in Elira's stated background. A simple bard would be unlikely to have developed such sophisticated understanding of governance and public policy, which meant either her background was more complex than she had revealed or her natural intelligence was far greater than might be expected. Music provides unique access to people's genuine thoughts and feelings, Elira replied smoothly. When you perform in taverns and market squares, you hear conversations that don't happen in formal settings. People speak more freely around entertainers than they do around officials, perhaps because they don't perceive us as part of the power structure that affects their daily lives. The explanation was plausible, but Captain Thorne caught something in her phrasing that suggested careful preparation. She had answered the challenge without directly addressing the underlying question about her qualifications to discuss complex political matters. It was the kind of verbal maneuvering he had seen from skilled negotiators and experienced diplomats. The evening light had completely faded now, leaving the blue salon illuminated only by the warm glow of oil lamps and the dancing flames in the fireplace. The intimate lighting seemed to encourage more personal conversation, as if the formal barriers that govern court interaction had softened along with the shadows. "Tell me," Kaelen said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than royal interrogation. "What drew you to court at this particular time?" Traveling performers usually follow established circuits and seasonal festivals. Your arrival here seems to have been carefully timed rather than coincidental. The question touched on something that had been bothering him since their first encounter. Elira's challenge had been too perfectly crafted, her understanding of court dynamics too sophisticated, her timing too precise for simple chance. She had come to Valvers with a specific purpose in mind, and that purpose went beyond merely testing her musical abilities against royal emotional defenses. Elira met his gaze steadily, and for a moment the careful diplomatic mask slipped enough to reveal depths of determination and ancient grief that transformed her pleasant features into something far more powerful. When she spoke, Her voice carried undertones that suggested the weight of promises made to the dying and obligations inherited across generations. I came because there are songs that need to be sung, Your Majesty. Stories that have been silent too long. Truths that have been buried beneath the accumulated weight of years and political convenience. She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the silver pendant at her throat. Sometimes, the only way to honor the past is to risk everything for the possibility of a different future. The cryptic response only deepened the mystery surrounding her, but before anyone could press for clarification, a commotion in the corridor outside the salon drew their attention. Heavy footsteps approached rapidly, followed by the sound of voices raised in urgent consultation. The door burst open to admit a travel-stained messenger whose mud-splattered clothing and exhausted demeanor spoke of hard riding through dangerous conditions. He dropped to one knee before the king, his breathing labored, but his message clear despite his fatigue. Your Majesty, he gasped. Urgent news from the eastern provinces. The Asterian ambassador has been found dead in his chambers at Riverton, and all evidence points to assassination. The messenger's words struck the blue salon like a thunderbolt, instantly transforming the evening's philosophical discussion into a crisis that threatened the very foundations of kingdom security. Ambassador Kaelen of Asteria had been in Valdres for 3 weeks, negotiating a crucial trade agreement that would have opened new markets for both kingdoms while strengthening their mutual defense alliance. His death under suspicious circumstances could easily be interpreted as an act of war. Kaelen was on his feet before the echoes of the announcement faded, his mind immediately shifting to the tactical considerations that such news demanded. Details, he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a king who had faced similar crises before. How was he found, by whom, and what evidence suggests assassination rather than natural causes? The messenger, a young man named Garrett, who served as one of the kingdom's most trusted couriers, struggled to catch his breath before responding. His personal servant discovered the body this morning, Your Majesty. The ambassador was found in his locked chamber with no signs of forced entry, but the palace physician identified clear evidence of poisoning, a rare substance that mimics the symptoms of heart failure, but leaves distinctive traces in the blood. Lady Seraphine's political instincts immediately grasped the implications. Who had access to his chambers? And more importantly, who benefits from the failure of the Asterian trade negotiations? The Shadowlands, Captain Thorne said grimly, his strategic mind already working through the possibilities. They've been pressuring their neighbors to isolate Valdres economically. If they can be blamed for the ambassador's death, it creates exactly the kind of diplomatic crisis that would force Asteria to reconsider their alliance with us. Chancellor Aldrich was already reaching for his writing materials, understanding that the next few hours would require careful coordination of diplomatic and military responses. We'll need to send immediate word to the Asterian capital, assuring them of our commitment to investigating this crime and bringing the perpetrators to justice. Any delay in communication will be interpreted as guilt or indifference. But it was Elira's reaction that surprised everyone present. Rather than the shock or confusion that might be expected from a civilian observer, she displayed the kind of focused attention that suggested experience with dangerous situations. Her brown eyes had sharpened with concentration, and her posture had subtly shifted to one of alertness rather than relaxed observation. Your Majesty, she said quietly, may I ask whether the ambassador's death occurred before or after he sent his regular reports back to Asteria? The question was astute, focusing on a detail that could significantly affect the diplomatic fallout from the assassination. If Kaelen had already communicated positive impressions about the negotiations, his death might be seen as an attempt to prevent completion of the agreement. If he had died before reporting, Asteria would have no context for understanding what he might have discovered that made him a target. Kaelen studied her face. noting again the inconsistency between her supposed background and her demonstrated understanding of complex political situations. An excellent question. Garrett, what information do we have about the ambassador's recent communications? His last dispatch was sent 4 days ago, Your Majesty. According to his secretary, he was preparing a comprehensive report on the progress of negotiations, but it was not yet complete at the time of his death. The implications were sobering. Without Kaelen's final assessment, Asteria would be left to draw their own conclusions about what had transpired during the negotiations and why someone might have wanted to silence their representative. In the absence of clear information, the natural tendency would be to assume the worst about Valdris's involvement or capability to protect foreign dignitaries. We need more than defensive measures, Serafina observed, her strategic mind working through the broader consequences. If we're perceived as weak or complicit in this assassination, it undermines not just the Asterian alliance, but our credibility with every other kingdom that has diplomatic relations with us. Agreed, Kaelen replied, beginning to pace as he worked through the available options. But we also cannot appear to be overreacting or deflecting blame without evidence. The investigation must be thorough and transparent, even if that process reveals uncomfortable truths about our security arrangements. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Elira rose from her chair and moved to the window, her attention apparently focused on something in the courtyard below. But when she spoke, her words carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than her supposed role as court entertainer. Your Majesty, there is something about this situation that requires your immediate attention. The ambassador's death was not simply assassination. It was a carefully orchestrated attempt to manipulate the succession crisis in the Shadowlands by forcing Valdris into a position where military action becomes unavoidable. The statement hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, challenging everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about both the crisis and the woman who had just demonstrated knowledge that no traveling performer should possess. Lady Seraphine's blue eyes narrowed with sharp interest, while Captain Thorne's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt. Chancellor Aldrich was the first to find his voice. Miss Elira, such an analysis requires access to intelligence that is not generally available to visitors at court. Perhaps you could explain how you've reached such a specific conclusion. Elira turned from the window to face the assembled group, and in that moment something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The pleasant mask of courtly deference fell away, revealing a depth of purpose and authority that transformed her from mysterious entertainer into something far more formidable. When she spoke, her voice carried tones that seemed to echo with power older than the current kingdom. Because, Chancellor Aldrich, I am not merely a traveling bard seeking royal entertainment. I am Elira of House Lireley, last of the Songweaver bloodline, and I have come to reclaim what was stolen from my family 3 centuries ago. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. House Lireley, the royal line that had supposedly died out generations ago, the bloodline that had once ruled Valdris with wisdom and song magic, the ancient dynasty that had been deliberately erased from common knowledge to make way for the current rigid caste system. If her claim was true, it meant that everything the assembled nobles understood about legitimate succession was about to be challenged. Lady Serafina rose from her chair with fluid grace, but her movement had the coiled tension of a predator, preparing to strike. A rather convenient revelation, don't you think? Claims to extinct bloodlines are easily made, but difficult to prove, especially when they surface at politically opportune moments. Proof, Elira replied calmly, reaching into her traveling pouch to withdraw an object that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, can be provided for those willing to witness it. The Soban chalice appeared in her hands as if summoned rather than merely produced, its silver surface inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the lamplight. The ancient ceremonial cup was unmistakable to anyone who had studied the old histories, a relic that could reveal the true magical compatibility between potential mates and, more importantly for the current situation, verify bloodline claims through power that could not be counterfeited. King Kaelen stared at the chalice with expressions that cycled rapidly through disbelief, recognition, and something approaching awe. The artifact had been lost for over 200 years, its location unknown to even the most dedicated scholars. Its sudden appearance in the hands of a woman claiming descent from the legendary Queen Elira suggested either an elaborate deception or a truth that would reshape the very foundations of his kingdom. The soulbound chalice responds only to those who carry the blood of its makers, Elira continued, her voice now carrying undertones of power that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential. If my claim is false, touching it will produce nothing. If my heritage is real. She trailed off, allowing the implications to settle in the minds of her audience. The chalice was more than just a relic. It was a test that could prove or disprove her assertion in ways that no amount of documentation or testimony could match. But it was also a challenge to the established order that went far beyond questions of individual identity. And if your bloodline claim proves legitimate, Seraphina said, her voice deadly quiet, what exactly do you intend to do with that knowledge? Elira's smile was gentle, but carried depths of determination that had been honed across generations of hidden preparation. I intend, Lady Seraphina, to offer King Kaelen a choice that no alpha ruler of Valdres has faced in 3 centuries, the opportunity to restore the ancient balance between strength and wisdom, between dominance and partnership, between the power of the sword and the magic of the song. Her gaze turned to Kaelen, and in her brown eyes he saw not challenge or threat, but invitation to something that might transcend everything he had ever understood about leadership and love. The question, Your Majesty, is whether you have the courage to discover what we might accomplish together. The dawn that followed Elira's revelation broke gray and ominous over the kingdom of Valdres, as if the very sky reflected the uncertainty that now gripped the royal court. In the space of a single evening, everything that the nobility had accepted as immutable truth had been challenged by the first appearance of both a lost bloodline and an ancient artifact that could verify claims thought impossible to prove. King Kaelen stood alone in his private chambers, staring out at the courtyard where his guards maintained their morning drills with the same precision they had displayed every day for years. The familiar rhythms of castle life continued unchanged, but he could feel the undercurrents of tension and anticipation that flowed through every corridor and gathering place. Word of the previous night's events had spread with the efficiency that only the most explosive gossip could achieve, and by sunrise, every person in the castle knew that their ordered world was about to be tested. The soulbound chalice sat on his writing desk, its silver surface catching the morning light and reflecting it back in patterns that seemed to shift with his breathing. He had not touched it, yet had not dared to discover what truths it might reveal about his own bloodline, his own capacity for the kind of partnership that Elira claimed to offer. The artifact represented possibilities that both thrilled and terrified him, because accepting what it might prove would require abandoning everything he had believed about duty, tradition, and the loneliness that he had accepted as the price of absolute power. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation, and Chancellor Aldrich entered with the careful bearing of a man who had spent the night wrestling with political calculations that defied his accumulated wisdom. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, his silver beard slightly disheveled, his robes bearing wrinkles that spoke of hours spent pacing in his chambers rather than sleeping. Your Majesty, Aldrich began, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent offering difficult counsel to 3 different monarchs. I have received preliminary reports from Riverton regarding the ambassador's death, and I fear the situation is even more complex than we initially understood. Kaelen turned from the window, his gray eyes immediately focused on the matter at hand despite the personal turmoil that occupied his thoughts. Details, old friend. What have our investigators discovered? The poison used was indeed rare, but not so exotic that it could only be obtained by foreign agents. More significantly, the method of delivery suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the ambassador's personal habits and daily routine. Aldrich paused, choosing his words with the care of a diplomat who understood that every phrase would be analyzed for hidden meanings. The evidence points toward betrayal from within his own delegation rather than external assassination. The implication struck Kaelen immediately. If Ambassador Kaelen had been murdered by someone in his own party, it suggested that the Asterian government itself might be split on the question of alliance with Valdres. The assassination could have been intended to prevent completion of negotiations that some faction considered contrary to Asterian interests. Political implications? Kaelen asked, though his strategic mind had already begun working through the possibilities. Severe and multifaceted. If we can prove that the ambassador was killed by his own people, it absolves us of direct responsibility, but raises questions about Asteria's internal stability. If we cannot prove it, we remain under suspicion of either complicity or incompetence. In protecting foreign dignitaries, Aldrich's expression grew more troubled as he continued. But there is another factor that complicates our response. Prince Mordain of the Shadowlands has formally announced his intention to claim the throne of his kingdom, and he has specifically cited Valdres's weakness in protecting allied representatives as justification for aggressive action along our borders. The news confirmed Elira's analysis from the previous evening, lending additional credibility to her claim of strategic insight that went far beyond what a simple performer should possess. Kaelen found himself wondering what other information she might have access to, and what resources had been available to the supposedly extinct Lirelais bloodline during their centuries of hiding. Recommendations? He asked, falling back on the familiar patterns of consultation that had guided his rule through previous crises. Militarily, we should increase border defenses and recall the 2nd Regiment from their training exercises in the southern provinces. Diplomatically, we need immediate communication with both Asteria and the legitimate claimants to the Shadowland throne, making our position clear before Prince Mordain can spread his version of events. Aldrich hesitated before adding, "Personally, Your Majesty, I believe you should also consider the implications of last night's revelations for your own position and the kingdom's future stability." The careful phrasing acknowledged that they were entering territory where traditional counsel might not be sufficient. The appearance of a potential Lirelais heir raised questions about legitimate succession that went beyond conventional political maneuvering into realms of ancient law and magical heritage that few living scholars fully understood. Before Kaelen could respond, Captain Thorne's distinctive knock announced his arrival. The guard captain entered with his usual efficient bearing, but his green eyes carried the alert tension of a professional soldier who sensed approaching conflict. "Your Majesty, we have visitors at the main gate. Lady Seraphine's family contingent has arrived unexpectedly, her father, Lord Goldmane, 3 of her brothers, and approximately 50 armed retainers. They're requesting immediate audience regarding urgent matters of succession and kingdom security." The timing was too precise to be coincidental. The Goldmane family possessed one of the most efficient intelligence networks in the kingdom, and their sudden mobilization suggested that they had learned of Elira's claims and decided that immediate action was necessary to protect their interests. Lord Goldmane was known for his strategic thinking and his absolute commitment to maintaining the traditional power structures that had elevated his family to prominence. And Miss Elira? Kaelen asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She has requested permission to access the castle's highest tower, claiming that she needs to prepare for what is to come. I've assigned guards for her protection, but she seems remarkably composed for someone who has just made claims that could result in charges of treason if they prove false. The captain's observation highlighted another aspect of the situation that troubled Kaelen. Elira's calm confidence suggested either remarkable courage or certain knowledge that her claims would be vindicated. Either possibility implied resources and preparation that went far beyond what she had initially revealed. A commotion in the corridor outside interrupted their discussion. The sound of multiple voices raised in urgent conversation, followed by hurried footsteps that suggested the arrival of more unexpected news. A young page burst through the door with the breathless urgency of someone bearing information that could not wait for proper protocol. "Your Majesty," the boy gasped. "Riders approaching from the east under Asterian banners. The advance scout reports that Princess Liana of Asteria leads the delegation, and she has requested immediate audience to discuss her brother's murder." The name struck Kaelen like a physical blow, not because of its political significance, but because of its personal resonance. Princess Liana of Asteria bore the same name as the love he had lost 8 years ago on the battlefields of Raven's Hollow. The coincidence felt like the work of fate, arranging circumstances to test every emotional defense he had built in the years since that terrible loss. Chancellor Aldrich's expression grew increasingly grave as he processed the implications of this new development. Princess Liana is known for her intelligence and her complete lack of patience with diplomatic niceties. If she has come personally, rather than sending representatives, it means Asteria considers this a matter of the highest importance. She will expect immediate answers and decisive action. "How long before she arrives?" Kaelen asked, his mind already shifting to the complex calculus of managing multiple crises simultaneously. 2 hours at most," the page replied. "Her escort is small but moves with military efficiency." Captain Thorne's strategic instincts immediately grasped the tactical situation. "We'll have Princess Liana demanding justice for her brother's death, Lord Goldmane pressing his daughter's claim to the throne, and Miss Elira preparing to prove her bloodline heritage. All while Prince Mordain masses troops on our borders and uses our supposed weakness as justification for aggression." The convergence of forces was unprecedented in Kaelen's experience, requiring him to navigate political, diplomatic, and personal challenges that could easily tear the kingdom apart if handled incorrectly. But there was also something almost mythic about the alignment of circumstances, as if ancient powers were arranging events to force a confrontation that would determine Valdris's future for generations to come. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said quietly, "I fear we are approaching a moment where traditional solutions may not be sufficient. The combination of external pressure and internal claims to legitimacy creates a situation that could easily spiral beyond our ability to control through conventional means." Kaelen nodded slowly, understanding that his chancellor was acknowledging something they had both sensed but not yet spoken aloud. The challenges they faced required more than political maneuvering or military strength. They demanded a fundamental choice about what kind of kingdom Valdris would become and what kind of leader he was willing to be. "Prepare the Great Hall for formal audiences," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a king who had made his decision. "Send word to Lord Goldmane that he and his family will be received with full honors. Extend the same courtesy to Princess Liana upon her arrival. And Captain Thorne ask Miss Elira to join us when she has completed her preparations. It appears that the time for testing has arrived." As his advisors departed to carry out their orders, Kaelen remained alone with the Soulbond chalice and the weight of choices that would echo through generations. The familiar world of absolute authority and emotional isolation was ending, whether he chose to embrace change or resist it. The only question now was whether he had the courage to step into an uncertain future where love might prove stronger than tradition, and where the song of an Omega Queen could reshape the destiny of a kingdom built on the premise that strength alone determined worth. Outside his windows, Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and in the distance, the sound of approaching hoofbeats carried the promise of confrontations that would test everything he had ever believed about power, partnership, and the price of genuine connection in a world designed to keep hearts apart. The Great Hall of Valdris had witnessed 3 centuries of momentous occasions, but never had its ancient stones contained such a convergence of power, ambition, and destiny. As the afternoon sun streamed through the towering stained glass windows, casting prismatic light across the assembled crowd, King Kaelen took his place upon the throne of Starfall steel, with the weight of his kingdom's future pressing down upon his shoulders. Before him stood representatives of forces that could either secure Valdris's prosperity for generations or tear it apart in a single afternoon. Lord Goldmane commanded the left side of the hall with his family's considerable retinue, his silver hair and hawk-like features radiating the authority of a man accustomed to shaping kingdoms through commercial power. Lady Seraphina stood at his side, her classical beauty enhanced by a gown of midnight blue that proclaimed both her status and her confidence in the outcome of this confrontation. Princess Liana of Asteria occupied the right side of the hall with military precision, her dark hair bound in practical braids and her travel-stained leathers speaking of hard riding through dangerous territory. Her resemblance to her murdered brother was unmistakable, but where Ambassador Kaelen had been known for diplomatic subtlety, the princess carried herself with the direct bearing of a warrior who preferred honest conflict to political maneuvering. Between these 2 factions, in the center of the hall, where tradition demanded that petitioners present themselves, stood Elira of House Lirelay. She had exchanged her simple traveling clothes for a gown of deep forest green that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, and the silver pendant at her throat pulsed with gentle radiance that drew the eye despite its modest size. In her hands, she held the Soban chalice, its ancient surface reflecting the sunlight in patterns that suggested movement just beyond the edge of perception. Chancellor Aldrich's voice cut through the tense silence as he formally opened the proceedings. By royal command, this assembly is convened to address matters of succession, alliance, and ancient law that bear upon the security and future of the Kingdom of Valdris. Let all who have claims to present come forward in the order of their noble rank. Lord Goldmane stepped forward first, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. His voice carried the authority of a man who had built one of the most powerful commercial empires in the known world through careful planning and ruthless execution. Your Majesty, he began, his words chosen with the precision of a master negotiator, I come before you not merely as the father of Lady Seraphina, but as a representative of the established order that has brought prosperity and stability to this kingdom for generations. The events of recent days have introduced elements of uncertainty that threaten to undermine the very foundations upon which our society rests. He gestured toward Elira with calculated dismissal. Claims to extinct bloodlines can be easily fabricated, especially when supported by artifacts of questionable provenance. What cannot be fabricated is the demonstrated loyalty, education, and political acumen that Lady Seraphina has shown through years of preparation for the responsibilities of queenship. The speech was masterfully delivered, acknowledging Elira's claims while undermining their credibility and emphasizing Seraphine's undeniable qualifications for royal partnership. It represented everything that traditional political thinking could offer in defense of established order. Princess Liana's response came with the directness that had made her famous among the diplomatic circles of multiple kingdoms. Lord Goldmane speaks of stability and tradition, but my brother lies dead while these games of succession distract from the real threats facing our alliance. Your Majesty, I require immediate answers about the investigation into Ambassador Kaelen's murder, and concrete assurances about Valdris's commitment to bringing his killers to justice. Her words carried the implicit threat that Asteria's patience with political maneuvering was limited, and that failure to satisfy their demands for action could result in the dissolution of treaties that had taken years to negotiate. The diplomatic and military implications were staggering, particularly with Prince Mordain already using the situation to justify aggressive action along Valdres's borders. It was then that Elira stepped forward, the Solban chalice cradled in her hands like an offering to ancient powers. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the hall, as if the castle itself recognized her right to stand before its throne. "Your Majesty, noble lords and ladies, honored princes," she began, her gaze encompassing the entire assembly while somehow remaining focused on Kaelen alone. "I come before you not to claim what was never mine, but to restore what was stolen from all of us when fear triumphed over wisdom and tradition hardened into tyranny over hearts." She lifted the chalice, and its silver surface began to glow with inner light that cast dancing shadows across the hall. This is the hour of testing that was foretold in the oldest prophecies, when the songs of the ancient queens would return to heal the divisions that have weakened our realm. The choice before King Kaelen is not between competing claimants to his throne, but between the isolation of absolute power and the strength that comes from genuine partnership. The light from the chalice intensified, and suddenly the air in the great hall filled with the sound of music that came from no visible source, a harmony of voices that seemed to echo across centuries, carrying the wisdom and power of every Omega Queen who had ever ruled with love instead of dominance. The ethereal music that filled the great hall seemed to come from the very stones themselves, as if the castle was singing the memories of queens long dead, whose voices had once guided Valdres through its greatest triumphs. The assembled nobles and dignitaries stood transfixed as the harmonies wove together ancient power and present possibility, creating something that transcended mere sound to become pure emotion made manifest. King Kaelen rose from the throne of starfall steel, his movement fluid and deliberate as he descended the steps toward where Elira waited with the glowing chalice. The music seemed to respond to his approach, growing stronger and more complex, as if recognizing the significance of this moment in the kingdom's long history. "I have spent 15 years ruling alone," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the supernatural harmony that surrounded them. 15 years believing that strength meant isolation, that wisdom required the sacrifice of personal connection for the greater good of the realm. But your song has awakened memories I thought buried forever, and shown me that true power might lie not in dominance, but in partnership." He reached for the chalice, and as his fingers touched its ancient surface, the light that had been contained within suddenly expanded to fill the entire hall with radiance that was warm rather than blinding. The music crescendoed into something magnificent and terrible, a sound that spoke of transformation on a scale that would reshape not just individual lives, but the very nature of royal authority. Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her composure finally cracking under the strain of watching her carefully laid plans dissolve in supernatural light. "This is madness, Your Majesty. You would abandon centuries of proven tradition for the sake of theatrical displays and romantic fantasies. The kingdom requires rational leadership, not magical spectacle." But her protests were overwhelmed by a new development that none of them had anticipated. The great doors of the hall burst open to admit Captain Thorne, his usually composed demeanor replaced by the urgent alertness of a soldier bearing news that could not wait for diplomatic niceties. "Your Majesty," he called out, his voice cutting through both music and argument with military precision. "Prince Mordain's forces have crossed our eastern border in significant numbers. 3 villages have already fallen, and our scouts report a full army advancing toward the capital." The announcement struck the assembly like a thunderbolt, instantly transforming the ceremonial challenge into a crisis that demanded immediate action. Princess Liana's hand moved instinctively to her sword hilt, her diplomatic mission suddenly secondary to the military reality of invasion. Lord Goldmane's face darkened with the knowledge that war would devastate the commercial interests he had spent decades building, but it was Elira's reaction that surprised everyone present. Rather than fear or confusion, her expression showed a calm determination that suggested she had been expecting this development. The light from the chalice pulsed more strongly, and when she spoke, her voice carried undertones of power that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential. "The ancient protections are awakening," she said, her gaze fixed on Kaelen, with intensity that seemed to see beyond the present moment into possibilities that others could not perceive. "But they require the willing bond of true partners to become fully manifest. Your Majesty, the choice is no longer between different forms of rule, it is between salvation and destruction. Between the magic that could shield our people and the forces that would tear our kingdom apart." The music that had filled the hall began to shift, becoming more urgent and martial, as if responding to the approaching threat. Through the great windows, those present could see smoke rising in the distance, evidence that Prince Mordaine's advance was proceeding with brutal efficiency against unprepared settlements. Kaelen felt the weight of generations pressing down upon him as he stood holding the chalice that could unlock powers beyond his understanding. Every instinct trained by years of conventional leadership told him to set aside these mystical concerns and focus on the immediate military crisis. But another part of him, the part that had been awakened by Elira's song, recognized that traditional solutions might not be sufficient against the forces arrayed against his kingdom. "Princess Liana," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command even in these unprecedented circumstances, "I pledge to you that your brother's killers will face justice. But first, we must ensure that there is a kingdom left to dispense that justice. Lord Goldmane, I require your family's commercial network to coordinate supply lines for our military response. Captain Thorne, mobilize every available defender and prepare for siege conditions." The orders were issued with practiced efficiency, but even as he spoke, Kaelen's attention remained focused on Elira and the choice that she had placed before him. The chalice seemed to pulse with warmth in his hands, as if responding to the sincerity of his desire to protect his people, regardless of personal cost. "And you, Elira of House Lorelei," he continued, his gray eyes meeting her brown ones with intensity that seemed to bridge the gap between duty and desire. "If your bloodline truly carries the power to protect this kingdom, then I place myself and my crown at your disposal. Show me how an Alpha King and an Omega Queen might rule together, in ways that our ancestors could only dream of." The moment hung suspended in golden light and ancient music, poised between the world that had been and the world that might yet come to pass. As outside the castle walls, the sound of approaching war drums began to echo across the endangered realm of Valdris. The moment Kaelen spoke his acceptance, the Soban chalice erupted with light that transformed the great hall into something beyond the realm of ordinary experience. The radiance that poured forth was not merely illumination, but visible manifestation of power that had been dormant for 3 centuries. Waiting for the conjunction of willing hearts and desperate need that could awaken protections older than the current kingdom. Elira's voice rose in harmony with the supernatural music that filled the air, her song weaving together threads of magic that had been severed when the old ways were abandoned for rigid hierarchy. As she sang, the light from the chalice spread beyond the confines of the hall, flowing through corridors and courtyards, rising through towers and walls until the entire castle glowed with the soft radiance of ancient protective enchantments coming alive. The effect was not limited to the royal seat. Across the kingdom, in villages and towns, in forests and fields, the magical barriers that had once shielded Valdris from invasion began to manifest as shimmering curtains of light that no hostile army could penetrate. Prince Mordaine's advancing forces found themselves suddenly unable to proceed, their weapons turned aside by defenses that existed somewhere between the physical and spiritual realms in the Great Hall. King Kaelen felt the transformation taking place within himself as the chalice's power flowed through him. The isolation that had defined his rule for 15 years was dissolving, replaced by a connection to his kingdom and his people that was deeper and more immediate than anything he had experienced through conventional authority. He could sense the relief of villages as the magical protections reached them, the amazement of his soldiers as ancient fortifications strengthened beyond any siege engine's ability to breach. But most profoundly, he could feel Elira's presence within his mind and heart, not as intrusion but as completion, the missing half of a partnership that made both of them stronger than either could be alone. Her song had become his song, her magic flowing through channels in his soul that he had never known existed. Lady Seraphina watched the transformation with expressions that cycled rapidly through disbelief, anger, and finally, a grudging recognition of realities that no amount of political maneuvering could alter. The power that surrounded Kaelen and Elira was undeniable, as was its effectiveness in protecting the kingdom from the immediate threat of invasion. Whatever her personal ambitions, she was too intelligent to ignore evidence that traditional approaches had proved insufficient where magical partnership succeeded. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the circumstances. "It appears that the old laws carry more authority than modern custom acknowledged. House Goldmane pledges its continued loyalty to the crown, regardless of how that crown chooses to protect the realm." The concession was gracefully delivered, acknowledging the new reality while preserving her family's position within whatever order would emerge from this day's events. Lord Goldmane nodded approvingly at his daughter's political acumen, recognizing that adaptation was often more valuable than rigid adherence to failed strategies. Princess Liana stepped forward, her warrior's instincts having quickly assessed the military implications of what she had witnessed. The magical defenses appear to have halted Prince Mordaine's advance completely. "Our alliance stands stronger than ever, Your Majesty, and Asteria looks forward to learning how these ancient protections might be shared with our other mutual allies." Captain Thorne's report confirmed what they had all sensed through the mystical connection that now linked castle to kingdom. "Enemy forces have withdrawn beyond our borders, Your Majesty. The magical barriers prove impassable to hostile intent, though they offer no impediment to peaceful travelers or legitimate trade." The strategic implications were staggering. Valdris had not merely repelled an invasion, it had acquired defenses that would make future aggression virtually impossible while maintaining the open borders necessary for commercial prosperity. The magical protections responded to intention rather than identity, creating a security system that was both absolute and discriminating. As the immediate crisis subsided, Chancellor Aldrich began the practical work of recording what had transpired for the kingdom's official archives. The Chronicle of New Beginnings would document this day as the moment when Valdris had reclaimed its ancient heritage while stepping boldly into an uncertain but promising future. 1 year later, the kingdom that had emerged from that day of transformation had exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of those who had witnessed the restoration of the old magic. The partnership between King Kaelen and Queen Elira had proven to be far more than a romantic union. It was a governing philosophy that had revolutionized how Valdris approached everything from international diplomacy to internal administration. The rigid caste system that had defined social hierarchy for centuries had been replaced by a merit-based structure that evaluated individuals on their abilities and contributions rather than their birth designation. Omegas who had been relegated to supporting roles found themselves appointed to positions of genuine authority, while Alphas learned that true leadership required cooperation rather than dominance. The change had not been without resistance, but the undeniable prosperity that followed had convinced even the most traditional nobles that the new ways served the kingdom's interests better than the old. International recognition of Valdris's transformation had led to alliance requests from kingdoms that had previously maintained careful distance from what they perceived as an aggressive, expansionist power. The magical defenses that protected the realm had allowed for a dramatic reduction in military spending, freeing resources for infrastructure improvements, education programs, and cultural initiatives that had enhanced life for citizens at every level of society. But perhaps most significantly, the investigation into Ambassador Kaelen's murder had been resolved through the enhanced diplomatic capabilities that Queen Elira's heritage provided. Her ability to sense deception and emotional undercurrents had quickly identified the traitor within the Asterian delegation, a man who had been secretly working for Prince Mordain's faction to sabotage the alliance negotiations. The discovery had not only cleared Valdris of any suspicion, but had strengthened the bond with Asteria by revealing shared threats that required mutual vigilance. On the first anniversary of their bonding ceremony, King Kaelen and Queen Elira stood once again in the Great Hall, where their partnership had been forged under such dramatic circumstances. The space looked much the same, but the atmosphere was transformed by the presence of representatives from dozens of kingdoms, who had come to witness the renewal of vows that had reshaped the political landscape of the entire region. Lady Seraphina, who had surprised everyone by becoming one of Queen Elira's most effective advisors once she redirected her considerable talents toward cooperative rather than competitive goals, approached the royal couple with a smile that held genuine warmth rather than calculated diplomacy. "Your Majesties," she said, offering the deep bow that had become standard protocol for the new court, "the delegation from the eastern provinces has arrived with the trade agreements you requested. They're particularly interested in discussing the magical protections that have made cross-border commerce so much safer and more efficient." Queen Elira nodded graciously, her transformation from mysterious wanderer to confident ruler having been accomplished with a grace that won over even those who had initially opposed her claim. "Excellent. Schedule the formal presentations for tomorrow morning, but arrange for informal conversations this evening during the celebration. Some negotiations proceed better with music and good food than with formal protocols." It was a perfectly diplomatic response that also reflected the more personal approach to governance that had become characteristic of their joint rule, where previous monarchs had maintained rigid barriers between royal authority and human connection. Kaelen and Elira had discovered that genuine relationships often produced better results than traditional power dynamics. As evening approached, and the anniversary celebration moved from formal ceremonies to joyful revelry, the royal couple found themselves with a rare moment of privacy in the blue salon, where so much of their courtship had unfolded. The room looked exactly as it had that first evening when Elira had challenged traditional thinking about governance and communication. But the two people who occupied it had been transformed by the year of partnership that had followed. "Do you ever regret it?" Kaelen asked, settling into the chair that had become his preferred spot for evening conversations. "Giving up the freedom of the road for the responsibilities of the crown?" Elira smiled, her fingers automatically moving to the silver pendant that had never left her throat, now one of the crown jewels of Valdris, recognized as a symbol of the restored magical heritage that protected the kingdom. "How can I regret finding exactly what I was searching for my entire life? The road led me here, to you, to this moment when the songs of the past have become the foundation for the future we're building together." She moved to the window where they could see the lights of the capital spread out below them, a city that was growing and prospering under their joint rule. "Besides, we haven't given up traveling entirely. The diplomatic missions to our new allies have shown me more of the world than I ever saw as a wandering performer." Kaelen joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing during their year of marriage. The magical bond between them had only deepened with time, creating a partnership that was both intimate and practical, personal and political. "What do you think the next year will bring? He asked, though he suspected she had insights that went beyond mere speculation. Change, she replied, leaning back against his chest as they watched the peaceful lights of their thriving kingdom. But the kind of change that comes from growth rather than disruption. The magical protections are awakening similar powers in our allied kingdoms, and the songs that have been silent for so long are beginning to be heard again throughout the region. Her voice carried notes of prophecy and possibility as she continued. I think we're witnessing the beginning of a new age, one where the walls between hearts come down, where partnerships replace dominance, and where the ancient wisdom learns to dance with new understanding. As if summoned by her words, music began to drift up from the celebration below, not the supernatural harmonies that had marked their bonding, but the joyful voices of people who had discovered that their leaders truly cared about their welfare. It was the sound of a kingdom at peace with itself and confident in its future, ruled by two people who had learned that love could indeed be stronger than tradition, and that the courage to tear down walls could build bridges that would last for generations to come.